Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening and for your support of the Wyoming State Archives Speaker Series. I'm Robin Everett. I'd like to take a moment to introduce some people that are here with us this evening. We have Sarah Davis, our state archivist. She's in the back of the room. We have Christina Bird, District Manager for State Parks and Historic Sites. And then we have Susie Taylor, who's our technical support and online moderator for tonight's program. I have a few housekeeping items to take care of. Please be certain to sign in at the sheet on the back of the table. If you haven't already, you can sign in on the way out. Please take a moment and silence your cell phones. Restrooms are in the lobby back towards the elevators. We also have remote viewers for this program. For everyone online and in person will have questions at the end of the program. For our viewers online, your mics and video are turned off during the presentation, but you will be able to turn them on during questions. If you want, you can raise your hand using the icon at the bottom of the screen, and Susie will call on you. Or if you prefer not to be part of the recording, you can ask your question in the chat box, and Susie will read it to our presenter. And also, please check out our display in the display case out here. We gathered some items regarding Quebec 01, and they're out there. This evening's program is one of our collaborative Wyoming State Parks Speaker Series, Quebec 01, Life in the Field. Our speaker is Superintendent Alexis Pratt. Alexis is a Colorado native who obtained her master's degree in museum studies in 2016. Shortly after graduating, she became a staff member of the Wyoming Historic Governor's Mansion, a position she held for 3 years before becoming superintendent. She later went on to also become the superintendent of the Quebec 01 historic site in the summer of 2020. Alexis will cover the origin of the site, its purpose and general use, and history over time. It will also include stories and duties of the people who have been stationed at the site, and an overview of what their day-to-day life is like. I'm going to turn it over to Alexis.
Well, hello everyone. So first question, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Christina, your vote doesn't count. Okay. So thank you guys for having me here tonight. I am very excited to have the opportunity to discuss Quebec 01 with you all and share some insight into what life would have been like for these guys out in the field. So as mentioned, we'll start with a very brief introduction and history of the site, which I'm sure some of you already might know. So I'll discuss what Quebec 01 is, what its mission was, and then I'll move into talking about the people themselves, their responsibilities, their duties, their experiences, and some of the stories that they have shared with us over the years. So we'll go ahead and get started. So what is Quebec 01? So Quebec 01 is a missile alert facility, or a MAF for short. And missile alert facilities were essentially launch control centers for a group of up to 10 missiles. Now, each of these missiles would have been housed in an underground silo ranging from 5 to 15 miles away from the MAF itself. So you can see here where Quebec 01 would have been and all of its silos surrounding that spot. This is very similar to how other missile alert facilities are set up in relation to their silos, pretty much in this same sort of pattern. Now, this pattern can differ a little bit depending on things like the terrain, the location of towns or cities, or sometimes other obstacles like the interstate. But for the most part, you will always find silos in this kind of configuration. Now, silos and missile alert facilities are spread out so they could be easily reached if needed, for example, during security checks. But they are located far enough away from each other, so any incoming attack from an opposing force wouldn't take out more than a few sites at a time. This was the hope, at least. But luckily, we never had to test this theory to find out. So the missile alert facility itself is kind of two separate sections. So you have topside and you have the capsule. Now, topside consists of areas like the kitchen, the flight security controller's office, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, multiple bedrooms, living room areas, usually some sort of gym space, bathrooms, and then maintenance rooms. The capsule itself is the underground portion of the MAF, and it consists of two spots. It consists of the LCC, or the Launch Control Center, and it consists of the LCEB, or the Launch Control Equipment Building. And this would house all of the equipment needed to keep the capsule running independently from the site topside if needed. So missile sites like Quebec One are still found throughout the country. And to put things into perspective for you guys and to give you all an idea of just how extensive these systems are, F.E. Warren currently controls 15 missile alert facilities and 150 silos spread throughout Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. Moving into site history, Quebec One was first constructed in 1962 as a Minuteman I missile alert facility. It was upgraded to the Minuteman III in the 1970s, and then finally in 1986, it was upgraded to the Peacekeeper missile system. Now, the Peacekeeper was very unique because the only sites that upgraded to this particular missile system were located here in Wyoming. And on that note, only 5 missile alert facilities, including Quebec One, ever had anything to do with this type of missile system. Now, during the years of 2004 and 2005, all Peacekeeper sites were deactivated and decommissioned due to various reasons, ranging from the cost of producing one of these Peacekeepers to also upholding with the various treaties that were being put into place at the time, such as the START treaties. Now, these treaties essentially put limits on how many nuclear warheads a country could have. And so that's one of the reasons why Quebec One and its other sister sites kind of went by the wayside. So the site was abandoned until 2018 when the U.S. Air Force transferred the property to the state of Wyoming to be used as a historic site. So we opened to the public in August of 2019, and we have been operating as such ever since. So now that I've had the opportunity to discuss a basic history and context of what Quebec One was with you all, we can move into talking about the people that made this all possible and the main focus of this evening's talk, starting with our topside personnel. Now, topside personnel included individuals like your facility managers, or your FMs for short. So their responsibilities were to keep up the site on the daily, the day-to-day. So this included taking care of all of the building needs. This included taking care of the grounds, ensuring all systems topside were working properly, and to see to the needs of any guests or VIPs. In talking with both current and former FMs, they like to refer to themselves as glorified babysitters. So that's kind of what their daily life was like. You would also have flight security controllers, or FSCs. So these were the ones who manned the security office. These were the ones who sent out security forces personnel when needed. They had the most contact with the missileers down in the capsule. They allowed entry to the missile alert facility, and this included multiple ID checks and additional security checks if needed. Essentially, your FSCs made sure that you were supposed to be there. Now, speaking from personal experience, they take their duties very, very, very seriously, as they should. But if you were not authorized to be there on a particular day, even if you had a visit scheduled, even if you had an escort to the site, even if you went through weeks of getting background checks, They would make you wait in a vehicle outside of the gates until they actually officially confirmed that you had the clearance and the authorization to be there. You also had a chef on site. This was arguably one of the more important positions in the missile field because they were the ones who kept everybody fed. Now, they did have very limited menus at these sites, so the chef could actually make you up some actual food. However, the lovely and well-known MRE was still a very common thing to find in the field. Your chef would also bring down food to the missileers down in the capsule if they requested it. So your security forces personnel were the ones who went out and did security checks on the silos when issues arose. Believe it or not, security forces personnel kept fairly busy out in the missile field. And that is because we had a few main enemies here on the Wyoming plains. So enemy number one was the cottontail rabbit. Enemy number two was the tumbleweed. And we laugh at these things, but things like the rabbits and the wildlife and things like the tumbleweeds, the wind, the snowdrifts, these things could and would set off security sensors at these silos, and you would have to go and make sure nothing was actually seriously happening. So even though 99.9% of the time the security issues you faced might be something simple like a tumbleweed or a rabbit or a snake, you want to train and prepare yourself for that 0.1% chance that something was actually seriously happening. Now, you would encounter other individuals in the missile field at times. Missile maintainers were one such person you could encounter. Missile maintainers were the ones who fixed things or the ones who did regular maintenance on the missiles and the silos. They would sometimes stay overnight at the missile alert facility if needed, either depending on how much maintenance they had scheduled or depending on how far away they were from town. You also had VIPs coming out to sites like this on occasion. Now, since Quebec 1 was so close to both Cheyenne and the highway, it was usually the site of choice. So anytime you wanted to show off a site like this to a foreign dignitary or to a high-ranking military official, they would typically be brought to Quebec 1 because of that ease of access. And this is how Quebec 1 became known as the showplace of the 90th. Now, on occasion, Quebec 1 and other sites like Quebec 1 would get protesters. These were usually peaceful protests. We never had record of anything serious happening at these protests. They were all just there to just kind of peacefully say their what they wanted to. For those curious, many of the protesters we got included local ranchers. The local ranchers who protested the missile systems, they protested for a couple of main reasons. Reason number one being they didn't want anything to do with the missile field, as they were concerned with how the long-term implications of something like this could have on their property, on their neighbor's property, things like that. But they were also very concerned about the threat of nuclear war happening in basically their backyards. So daily life topside could be very boring at times. Usually what would happen is you would do 12 hours on, 12 hours off in terms of your shift. And this could also be very isolating as well. And you actually couldn't leave the missile alert facility once you got there for a shift. You had to stay there for the full duration of your cycle, which could be anywhere between 24 and 72 hours at a time. And you would also be anywhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours away from town. So things like recreation became very important. This is why missile alert facilities are built with recreation areas, with living areas in mind, because you would want to do things like hang out, you would want to do things like play video games, watch TV, listen to the radio. Again, most of these sites have some sort of gym on site, so a lot of different options to keep the time passing and to keep yourself from going a bit stir crazy in the middle of nowhere. So now we can talk about your capsule personnel. Now, arguably, when people come to visit Quebec 1, without knowing a whole lot about the missile field, or sometimes even if they do know a whole lot about the missile field. The part they are most excited for is to get on the elevator and to go downstairs into the capsule. And the capsule is where you would find a team of some of the most important people in the missile field. This is where you would find your capsule crew. So you would have two missileers, never less than two. You would have a commander and a deputy commander. These are the highest ranking individuals on site, and they served 24-hour shifts. So their duties, they did have a lot of things they needed to do, but their main ones were to monitor and check the status of all of the silos and therefore the missiles in those silos. So the missileers down here could determine what sort of security issues were taking place at the silos. They could determine if security forces needed to be sent out, things like that. These were highly classified positions at times, and your missileers also served as your key turners. So if given the order to do so, your missileers would go through a series of steps, ending with a key turn that could launch a nuclear missile. In terms of capsule life for these two people, options for the missileers were sometimes even more limited to what those topside could do. And that is because the Launch Control Center where they did their work was an incredibly small space. So they would do their regular duties, they would do their security checks, their equipment checks, things like that. But, you know, again, you're down here for 24 hours at a time. You would still have a fair chunk of free time. And so things like reading, watching movies, playing cards would also be a way for you to pass the time. They did have the ability to sleep. Tucked behind these curtains here is a very small twin-size bed. So you could shut those, those drapes there and try to get some shut-eye as well. Even so, though, missileers still sometimes struggled with this. They still sometimes had ways to struggle to find ways to pass the time. And they got very creative in the way they would do this. One missileer I talked to actually ran a construction company on the side. And so what he would do when he was on shift is he would bring down his books, he'd bring down all of his materials, some of his materials, and he would calculate the price of projects. He would write up invoices. He would balance the checkbook, all for his side construction business. Another missileer I talked to actually worked with a guy who every single shift he would bring down an exercise bike, and he would find a way to squeeze that exercise bike in the LCC, and he would sit there when he could, and he would ride his exercise bike just to give him some sort of physical activity while he was down in the capsule. So they definitely found some pretty creative ways to pass the time this way. And there's probably many more stories out there. So now that I've had the opportunity to share and discuss the people at these sites, I'd like to share a few of the stories that people have told us over the years, and some of the stories that have become fan favorites amongst staff, volunteers, and myself. So our first story is called The Missileer and the Briefcase, and I did not intend to make these sound like 5-year-old children's books. They just kind of came out that way. Now, an important background piece of information for this story that you guys must know is that all missileers travel with a briefcase, and they must keep this briefcase with them at all times, because in these briefcases is some top secret and highly classified information. And so one day, a team of missileers was traveling out to a site in Nebraska, and they were in the city of Pine Bluffs, which, for those of you who don't know, is right on the border of Wyoming and Nebraska. So they are driving past, and they decide to pull off the highway at this little A&W in Pine Bluffs for a bite to eat, which was a fairly common practice amongst people traveling to and from the missile field. So they pull off at the A&W, they enjoy their meal, they get back in their car, they're heading back to the highway, and they're heading down to the site. And about 20 minutes goes by, and one of the missileers realizes that he left his briefcase back in Pine Bluffs at the restaurant, which is not good, right? So they begin to panic pretty wildly, and eventually they calm down, they turn around, they speed back to Pine Bluffs, which is not an easy thing to do in a military vehicle, I've heard. So they arrive back, they quickly head inside, they go check the booth they were at, and the briefcase is not there. So they check other booths, the entire restaurants, they can't find the briefcase. More panic ensues. And so they go up to the person working the counter, they explain the situation, and the person there is like, oh yeah, we have the briefcase in the back, let me go get it for you. So they reacquire their briefcase, they get back in their vehicle, they head to the site. Surprisingly, they're only 20 minutes late for their shift change. They do their shift change, and they never speak of this story again until someone told it to one of us. So the moral of this story is to always know where your stuff is. Second story we have is about a false alarm of sorts. So for those of you who have studied these systems, for those of you who know far more than I do about these systems, you might be familiar with certain accidents that have taken place in the missile field over the decades. Now, there were never any full-blown accidents at Quebec 1 or any of its silos, but we did come very close on June 15th, 1988, about 15 months after the Peacekeeper systems were retrofitted to fit old Minuteman III sites. So on this particular day, a Peacekeeper missile partially collapsed inside of its silo at Quebec 1, or Quebec 10, excuse me. Now, it only fell about 6 to 8 inches in that silo, but this was enough to trigger a missile away indicator to the commander in the LCC at Quebec 1. So much like the last story, panic ensues, because they don't know why this is happening. There was no exercise plan, there was no training plan, there was nothing planned that this should happen. So obviously, after a minute, they calm down, they work through the system, they realize what happened. But as they're doing this in the LCC, technicians are headed out to the field to also kind of figure out what's going on. Now, the technicians have the protocol that as soon as they get there, their job is to restore power to the silo and the missile. However, in this particular case, that was the absolute last thing you wanted to do, because restoring power to the silo and the missile could actually cause an explosion while the missile was underground. But no one told them to stop until it was almost too late. Luckily, they avoided this in the nick of time. Everyone got together, everyone started communicating better, and eventually everything went back to normal. They were able to fix the problem, and the systems were normalized. The moral of this story is that communication is very important. And then the very last story that I have is probably my favorite story. We call it Elevator Cow. And what happened on this particular day is that it was evening time. Security forces and those topside were getting pretty bored. It was a very slow day for the missile field. And so security forces and the chef and the FSC team up with one of the neighboring ranchers to borrow a cow because they wanted to sneak that cow down to the capsule and play a practical joke on the capsule crew. So they get the cow into the sites, they load the cow onto the elevator, and these are really large elevators, like they could probably fit 2 or 3 cows, to be honest. So they load the cow up, the chef and the cow head down to the capsule. The FSC calls down to the commander and the deputy commander, and they say, hey, you know, the chef is headed down with your food, open up the blast door. Yeah. So the commander and his deputy, they open up the blast door. Lo and behold, there's a cow standing there right with them, right with the chef. I can only imagine one of 2 things happened. Either the capsule crew found it very humorous and they laughed, or they were incredibly pissed off. We don't know which happened. I choose to go with the former. But that's one of the ways that they can pass the time, is to sneak cows into the launch control center, I guess. So that is all I have for you guys. Again, thank you so much for having me. The site will be opening in May. So please, if you want to learn more about the site, please feel free to come out to visit us in person. We would love to have you. Questions? Yeah.
So they went out to check on the rabbit. Did they eliminate that rabbit?
It depends on who you ask. We were always told, and we have been told, that for the most part they just let the rabbits alone. But I have heard from some people that they would get bored and they would take the rabbits out. It just kind of depends.
You mentioned about the protests and some ranchers protesting,
Mhm.
which makes me wonder how the land was selected. And if it was ranch land, did the Air Force lease that land? And how did that affect the cattle ranch?
So to be honest, it doesn't affect the cattle at all. We still, the site is fenced. And so, but we still get cattle that come like right up to the fence or who are right up on the road. Sites were chosen based on where they were located. Pretty much anywhere in Wyoming was up for grabs because it's the middle of nowhere. It's the plains, so there's not a whole lot going on. Yeah.
Okay, but why are the ranchers protesting? And did they get money for having their land leased?
They did get a little bit of money, yes. But I think the biggest thing is they didn't want missiles in the ground because they didn't know long-term effects. They didn't know if accidents happen, what could occur at the lands. Environmentally, they didn't know, and they were concerned about those sorts of aspects.
Okay, so did they have a choice?
No. They did not.
So the government picked out a piece of land and condemned it and just paid them for what they thought it was worth and took it over, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of whether they wanted to or not.
Essentially, yes.
In regards to that, it wasn't just the site that the main launch facility was at or where the missiles were, because they've got miles and miles and miles of underground cabling interconnecting all of these. And it's not just the one site with its own 10 missiles, but it was also interconnected to 4 other sites that also had 10 other missiles. And so any one site could control any and up to 50 missiles, depending on circumstances. So the ranchers had to provide access to put all that cables and cabling in to connect everything, in addition to the actual surface area. And the surface area for a particular missile, for example, was only maybe 100 yards square, with a little short access road from the highway. But it was all the rest of it that went together with everything else.
If I could add just a bit of nuance to the
Yeah.
question. So Lindy Kirkbride,
Mhm.
who was like in the middle of the anti-MX protest, Mary Dallin Kirkbride, and Kirkbride Ranch out north down. She was hardcore pacifist.
Yes.
So you had that kind of strain among the protests also, and they just didn't his weapons here.
Yes. Thank you.
Another thing that happened was they had to have roads.
Yes.
And so on our land, it's split up pastures. And so there wasn't then access to irrigation.
Right.
So then they had to put in windmills and other sources of water for livestock. So it was a pretty big impact.
Yes.
Where is the Quebec one? Exactly?
So, an excellent question. Quebec one is about 30 miles north of town. It's right off of exit 39 on I-25.
The one that was on our land was at exit 25, and it was an underground,
Okay.
and it's still there,
Yes.
of course. And I'm not sure they It's not active.
It's not. So when they deactivated these sites, what they did with the silos is they left the fencing, they left the top part, but they did take the missiles out and they did implode the silos themselves.
There is one on the Kirk right place too.
Alexis, what's your most common question asked by people who are touring the site?
The most common question we get is probably it's when we're down in the LCC and talking about the missileers and their duties. The most common question is, where's the bathroom? Because the missileers did have a very small lavatory in the LCC, but 99% of people pass it as they're walking into that portion of the capsule. That's probably the biggest question we get.
It's about the size of a porta potty in a camp.
Yeah.
Very, very small. Got a little curtain comes right up. The reason I know, I spent 3 years down in the hole.
We have an expert.
And it's yeah, very small. In regards to the land issue, one other item, if you've been reading the papers, it's been in there for a while now. They're coming up with a brand new complete missile system to replace everything. And they're in the process right now of going back through this whole thing with site selection for land, for easements, for everything that has to go to be able to put a whole new system in the ground out here. So if you own land, you may end up seeing the government again. Maybe not in the exact same spot, but maybe for another site close. You know?
There is a draft EIS that's available if you're concerned. Go look at the Air Force plans. It's going to be expensive.
So I've rented a Atlas site east of town for about 10 years.
Mhm.
And obviously there's numerous pollution issues
Yeah.
on the site, which are going to be like a 200-year cleanup.
Yes.
And we see the Corps of Engineers coming in every year to drill more wells and all that kind of stuff. Was it the same kind of pollution issues with these sites, or have they figured out not to drain stuff straight east of town by that time?
By that point, they had learned not to drain stuff,
Right.
and it wasn't quite as extensive as,
Right.
as the Atlas sites.
That's-
Yes, right.
It's clear that you have spoken to people and you have these great stories. When you talk to people, are you doing oral histories? So these are recorded, and so there's a collection somewhere at the archives, perhaps, that people can look at those?
Unfortunately, that's one thing we don't really have a lot of. It's definitely on our list of things to do. A lot of the stories that we hear are just kind of in passing. So when people come up to visit the site who had experiences and we're giving tours, they like to relive the glory days, and they share their stories that way. And so a lot of it is just kind of word of mouth sort of stuff.
We do have the option now on the Quebec One website on Wyoming State Parks to be able to either record or type your story into the website itself, and it'll get downloaded and sent to site staff.
Yes.
It would just be good to have the history, the stories from those who served at the sites, but I like to know what the ranchers were thinking too, and all of that, so it'd be great if it was a little bit broader than.
Yeah, it's definitely something we're working on. It's definitely a goal for the future.
Was there fencing around these sites to keep like animals and deer out of it?
Yes.
Or what?
Yes, so both the missile alert facility and all of the silos are fenced. They've been pretty good. I don't have exact numbers right now, but we've seen a steady increase since COVID. So people are learning about us and they're coming to see us, which is what we want to see.
And when are you open?
So we open back up in May. We're typically open mid to early May until the end of September.
Alexis, what was the biggest surprise that your aha or holy crap?
I've had a few. I think when I learned just how expensive the peacekeepers were, that was kind of a really, oh goodness moment. And also realizing that it takes only 30 minutes for a missile to go from launch to target was pretty impressive too. I think those are my two biggest ones.
And how much did it cost?
Christina, is it millions or is it billions? I always forget.
You're asking the wrong person.
No, I know.
I know it's up there. I know it's at least a few $1 million to make just one peacekeeper.
I thought it was like 70 million, if I
That
recall correctly.
sounds correct.
Does
Yeah.
that sound correct?
So yeah, so 70 million for just one peacekeeper.
To give you an
$10.
example.
Yeah.
The guidance system on the old, well, they're still here, the Minuteman III. The main primary guidance system for that, because I, not only being in the capsule, but I will end up working in accounting at Warren after I retire, but the guidance system itself that goes on top of that thing, it's $4 million. And that's just one little part of the whole package.
And Quebec one does have one of those on display. So you can come in and look at part of the missiles guidance system. It's a gyroscope essentially, and they're built by hand. Each and every single part is built by hand. They're pretty impressive.
Well, that was one of the things that made the MX for Speaker so revolutionary was first, it was birthed. It carried 10 warheads. Each one of the warheads could be targeted at a target. It's not just stabilized things, and they were incredibly accurate.
Yeah.
And it was a revolutionary weapon system.
Well, the Minuteman IIIs that are out there still in the field are also merged missile free. And they have up anywhere from 1 to 3 warheads on each one. And each same thing. Each one can go to a totally different target.
What company built these papers?
It was a combination of a few different ones. So Boeing, for example, did the gyroscope and the guidance system. Northrop Grumman did part of it, and then there's one other company that I can't quite remember. Lockheed Martin did part of it as well. And they split it up so one company wouldn't know how to basically build a nuke from scratch, and so they did different pieces to different companies, which makes sense.
If a person visited the site today, how long should they plan for the visit?
So I would say at least an hour. So the guided portion down to the capsule is about 30 minutes, and then you can take your time kind of exploring topside and the grounds.
Talking about the oral side of it, it's really important because I've done this kind of off my own back with the Atlas site because it's a whole generation of people that are passing away.
Yeah.
And we were out there one Sunday, and these two old gentlemen from Colorado came, just drove in, which is kind of unusual. And they said, we hope you don't mind if we come to visit. But he said, I worked for Convair and I installed the first Atlas missiles out here on the site. And I could have hugged the guy because there's so little known about the site we're on. We don't know what we're looking at half the time. So we walked around the site and he told us about all these stories about things that had happened and everything else. It was absolutely amazing. And it ended up with him actually sending me the base activation plans that he's had for all these years, which has your sites on here as well, I believe.
Nice.
And I've kept in touch with him via email, and I've told him whatever he remembers, send it to me in an email. It doesn't matter what it is, send it to me. So I've got quite a lot of emails from him about things that happened and funny stories and stuff, because it is so important to write it down.
It is.
So each day was probably pretty boring, and if you had a side job, you kind of do that, or much instead. Was there ever a day where they have to go on high alert after lots of threat?
There are a few. So the one that comes to mind was during 9/11. That was probably a pretty high stress, high alert day. And there are probably many others that we don't know about. But it did happen on occasion, yes.
Primarily, when you're down there, you're on alert full time, 24/7, a whole year. I mean, it's man. There's never a moment, basically, when it's not bad, and it's always on alert. So the world situation heightens some of the activities around the capsule, like at the base. but they don't have a major impact down below because you're already there to go to turn the key. That's your job. So there's not a big impact below, but up above there is.
I talked to missileers who served at Atlas sites during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were telling you that was the high point in the history of missiles in the United States Air Force. And they say the same thing, you know, Cuban Missile Crisis, we were on alert anyway. It really
Right.
affect this, yeah.
If you want, I can give you an interesting story that happened to me and my deputy one time.
Absolutely.
It was the day that our capsule ended up going completely dark. We disappeared from the grid. All four of the other sites immediately noticed that we were gone. It was like we'd been attacked and destroyed. We vanished from the system. That triggered alerts all the way back to SAC headquarters in Omaha. They helicoptered out security teams to the site where we were. We're sitting down in there, and if any of you have been in caves underground on tours that turn out the lights, you know how dark it gets? Well, believe me, it's that way down in there. I mean, you're in something that's smaller than a boxcar. Okay. And when the lights go out, 60 feet underground, there's nothing. And so we ended up managing to figure out to grab hold of a flashlight. First thing we do after that is we get our weapons out because we had weapons in the capsule. And anytime somebody came down, we always wore a weapon. Didn't matter who it was. But so after we'd been down there, we tried to call, phones didn't work, nothing worked. We were totally dead. Everything. Wasn't a life one in there or nothing. We got over to there's a small blast door, it's about 4 foot square, that opens in. We got out there, we opened the door. As we got ready to step out, these topside security forces were standing there with loaded M16s pointed at us. And we're standing there with a loaded M38 revolver in our hands at the same time, facing them. And of course, being that they knew who we were and everything, we were able to come out. We were able to go ahead and go topside because there was nothing that you could do down there. It turned out that a circuit breaker, probably a $20 part, the main breaker, because the capsule did not run on outside power. It ran internally. Outside power fed a generator that in turn actually ran the capsule. But if you lost all power, underneath the floor is a series of submarine batteries that would capable of running that capsule for they don't know how long, a week, 2 weeks at a time. Apparently the breaker failed, the power lost. We were on batteries for nobody knows how long until the batteries died. And so there was nothing really happening, but during that time, one of the other sites took control of our 10 missiles. So somebody had 20 of there to take care of while the others had 10. But again, it was one of those things that created an absolute major back to headquarters at SAC. Capsule vanished, disappeared. You know. And it was definitely scary.
Yeah.
Tell you that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and then when besides the topside security force, like I said, they helicoptered a whole batch of them into the base. We were out in my home site in Echo, and just on the outside of Pine Bluffs in Colorado. When it's in that corridor where when you go in, you go out of Pine Bluffs, you go south into there. But yeah.
How long did it take to get that back up?
I have no idea. because we did back then we were doing double 12-hour shifts, so we were on duty we were out in the field for 2 days at a time. They changed it since because they changed equipment. So the crews now do 24. We were out there for 12. We weren't, even though we had the bed, we were not allowed to sleep. And we did 12 hours, 12 on, 12 up, 12 down, 12 up, and then you go home, type thing. But
So they reassigned you to a different.
well, yeah, because we would do a tour, we'd be off for a couple, 3 days, we'd go out again. So we never always went to the exact same site every time. It was however the schedulers worked it all out. So I might be down in by Sterling, Colorado on one tour. I might be out in a number of them we did were at Cycle Hotel, which is about 5 or 8 miles outside of Sydney. That was the longest. I used to tell people, yeah, we drove to work 105 miles to drive to work. Because that's literally, we drove from Cheyenne out there to the site, and then we would drive back. And so you never knew for sure where exactly you might end, although you had a permanent site that you would go maybe 50% of the time, but they would move you around everywhere.
Would there be crossover between Peacekeeper and Minuteman sites?
Pardon?
Would there be crossover between Peacekeeper and Minuteman sites?
No.
No. Okay.
No, the Peacekeeper were totally 100% isolated, independent. And we actually, none of the other four sites, when there were 5 of them together, none of the other 4 interconnected either. In other words, you were, well, I take that back. You were interconnected within your own foursome. But then the other 3 groupings, you had no connection with them whatsoever. The other ones were isolated. So you had the ability, depending on the circumstance, to control your 10 up to 50. They also had the ability to launch those from the air.
So we've got a comment online that says the real unsung heroes of the 400th were the site chefs. The better ones can craft a gourmet meal out of the foil packets, basically TV dinner entrees. They'd get up at all hours to fix an RO Enning MX team meals and took good care of topside and LCC crew. Yes.
And you showed the MREs on the screen, but when I was down there, Cheyenne has, I don't know if they still do, but they had a complete kitchen set up. They manufactured all the food that not only went to our sites, but they would send them to Maelstrom, to the other missile bases. All the food that went down that was for the base for those sites was all manufactured in Cheyenne. It was in individual, like a TV dinner. Your corn was in one small packet, green beans in another, meat in a different, potatoes. That was all made on site in Cheyenne at Warren, freeze dried and shipped all over to the other bases. And we had, she says, chefs this day. You had cooks. You had a cook. I take it back. You had a food warmer. You had a cook. You also had chefs. Depending on the sites you were in, who was going there, as to what you ended up. My home site, we had a chef. He could take those frozen packets and he could absolutely put together a meal like you can't believe out of that stuff. Other guys come in, you pick out what you want, they warm it up, send it down. You know, our chef also, the other thing you said, they stayed on site. Not true. The security force, when our chef got to the base that day for his tour, the security force would go into Pine Bluffs, tire check, tear up the tires. While they were there, they'd go to the grocery store and they would bring back, I don't know, half a dozen more boxes cornbread nights. And our chef would start, I don't know if you've seen the chow hall pots, they're like 20 or 30 gallon ones. He would start a pot of beans as soon as he got out there. It'd sit there till the next day. And then he would make fresh cornbread, and we'd have cornbread and beans. And he'd use the ham out of the meals to also throw into the pot with it. And if the maintenance people that were working out in the field heard that he was at site, they all somehow had to stop there. Because, yeah, Charlie's beans and cornbread were known throughout everywhere. I mean, it was, but again, you had 3 different kinds of people to fix your food.
Any other questions?
Is there a similar type of program for the old Atlas sites? I mean, you see Site D when you go to Laramie out there by Granite Canyon. And
There is not, as far as I know.
is there a place where you have information that about the history or the program?
I'm gonna take my phone number, you can come visit anytime you like. We'll show you around the exhibition.
If you know somebody that, where the land is located,
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough, I knew somebody else who knew somebody else. We were able to get access through an individual up on 85, off of 85, out of town a ways, going up towards Torrington up that way.
And the city,
I was fortunate enough to be able
Well,
to.
the Atlas sites are no longer part, they've been.
No, there's nothing there, just some buildings.
Yeah, but the government's not involved. Have they been turned back? over
No,
to
it's right.
the
Right.
ranchers?
The ranchers control
Yeah,
access
they
to that,
control,
yeah. Yeah, they're just sitting there because they were built with massive concrete thick walls and all the rest. To try to destroy it all and clean it out would be enormously costly and
Sure.
a lot of work.
If you come and visit ours, you get the added bonus of visiting all the train restorations that I'm doing inside the silo as well. So you can see vintage trains and the missile silo at the same time.
Ellen, I guess it's worth pointing out that the city of Windsor actually has one of our former Atlas sites that they run as a city
Right.
park. Yeah, they have an Atlas East site.
Friend of mine has been there. He was here at Warren back then when the Atlas was still here. When he was here, of course, and he worked on the Atlas system when he was here in Cheyenne. And he told me about the one out by Windsor.
That was an Atlas E. Yeah, the Atlas sites here in Cheyenne are absolutely, they're historically so important because they're the only ones of their kind that still exist. It's a shame that we're not doing more, right? Although it sounds like.
Trying to,
Yeah,
It's not mine, I'm trying.
Any other questions?
They had an open house at FEW when Atlas first came. First thing they did was drop the door right in the middle of the nose where the Atlas missing. You walk by it, here's the door.
Oops.
You wondered how many million that cost.
Thank you very much for coming this evening. Truly, I appreciate it. I appreciate your stories too.
Yes.
Very cool. And the
Well,
Atlas,
thank you.
we'll get your number.
Please.
Please be sure to check out the display and in the display case. Alexander Allison worked with Susie to put it together. And so it's really cool. It kind of covers a little bit of everything about the site. And also next month, our program is going to be on April 13th. We're going to have Wyoming author Roger McDaniel. He's going to talk about his new book, Profiles in Courage, Standing Against the Wyoming Wind. And he'll also have books available to sell or to purchase. Okay. Thank you very much for your continued support. It was nice having you this evening.
Good program.